use their wonderful home. So, let's just introduce ourselves and maybe say, you know, if you're a musician or something, you could put that in. If you're a lover and just learning, say that too, you know. You're first.
Alright, I'm Houston Stock. I'm Houston Stock, and I've been playing for about 5 years, but I just started playing jazz probably like 6 months ago, so for like a couple of years probably. I played for the middle school jazz band, and going into my freshman year, probably gonna play for the high school.
You enjoy jazz? Well, you're gonna learn a lot about it. Where the jazz.
Carolyn Stock. She played in the music show in the late 60s or something. They used to, she played pianos for the little kids, and they used to sing in the big band.
Just a question, Mr. Bailey.
I'm not sure what it's called, but it was really popular.
Did you leave?
My grandmother played for it.
Sounds like my grandma.
Wasn't one.
Well, we'll get there. We'll probably figure it out. I say that obviously, like so many things, I want to say on the planet, but in Healdsburg, it wouldn't happen without like Jessica. I mean, it's her vision that makes people like me a reality. So certainly, that if you got a Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci or Einstein or whatever, you've got at least 100 or maybe 500 of each one of those. It's just one person that recognized them and actually suggested that they had something valuable to give to humanity. So in the business that I'm in, if you want to call it a business, whatever you call it, if you're an American, Jessica is one of the great visionaries that I know of in this country. I mean, this makes her extremely important, extraordinarily important to the musicians, but to people like you. I mean, certainly I wouldn't have even considered doing anything like this if I hadn't had some kind of relationship with her. I'm too busy trying to do this to the best of my ability for my own aesthetic values, to say nothing of the fact that it's my survival. That's enough to make it, my concentration, my total, that's enough to full concentration, right? So without somebody like Jessica, I wouldn't even think that's just too much to do. I remember when I met my wife, the first thing I told her, it was romantic, was that I had my life's worth of work to do. And that was my intention, to spend my life trying to do this. Well, love had something to do with it. I don't know what else. I don't know what else you would call it, that kind of desire.
Maybe you have a mission.
Yeah. So, and that's all I do. I never think of myself. It's only people like you, maybe you, that say that he's okay, or he has some kind of contribution, or has made some kind of valuable contribution. But I don't have time to. That's not why I'm doing it, evidently.
One night that Billy was visiting in the house, and somebody asked him a question about a drum question, and 3 hours, at least 3 hours later, we were starting to hear, it just, and I knew that he had a wealth of knowledge, but I just never realized how deep he knows the history, and that's why it's always been something that I've people, that's an intimate place in a close setting, that something like this, I can't think of a better way to learn about his music.
So I don't know if it makes sense for you guys just to ask questions,
No. This is the history.
or because obviously she is intimated to you that I can talk about it, forever. So as how to best do this, I haven't displayed here, but I have brought substantial videos and records and stuff like that. What I did bring, what happens in age, like I'll have something from the 20s or something from the 30s or 40s or 50s, but then the 60s is my area, so then I'll have like 40% of the thing will be from my area. Got tape on this stuff. Okay. Because I end up telling people, like, if you want to make something, put it in Isaac Stern's violin or Pavarotti's mouth. Please don't stop my drums from singing. a version of the instrument. And the way it's played from my viewpoint and my generation's viewpoint, which includes as much as I know about the past and a lot of what I hope for in the future. So now I'd like to show you what I know on because of this, a learning of the past. But once Jessica made the I really, it was an opportunity to learn even more about the past, and it's been very enjoyable for me. I mean, in just 2 or 3 days to deal with this, it's been extraordinary for me. So I'd like to start with this now to show you. I'm going to show you three viewpoints, 3 beginning viewpoints of what I think is the 3 viewpoints of the thing. So let's start first. The DVD? This is the DVD, the Steve Smith. This is a drummer, Steve Smith, that I met for the first time in about this time last year, and he came to see me play, and I knew him because he was famous as how do you describe a few period in my lifetime towards in the last 30 years when jazz was American music was divided into certain areas. So it was American music, it was jazz, then this was some kind of it started calling the music jazz rock. Right? And then after that it was called fusion. So this guy, Steve Smith, is one of the better known exponents of this thing called jazz rock or fusion. Now, so he in Spain about this time last year, he was with a band, one of those kinds of bands, and which was, who was in it? Hiram Bullock was playing guitar, Bill Evans, Randy, trying to think who the bass player, but one of those kind of fusion. And we talked, and he showed me that he had an interest in the beginnings of jazz. And man, I've even made a video. I said, please send it. And he did. He sent it to me. Yeah. He's Steve Smith, Billy Higgins. So, but Jessica said, I said, oh, looking through things. I said, oh, here's the Steve Smith thing. Let me put it on. And he had done it. So that's what you're getting ready to see. Well, but it's going to be 3 different viewpoints of this situation.
Or 4 generally played time on the snare, sometimes the woodblock or the rim. And by this time, the drum had grown a bit.
Oh, wait a minute. This
consisted
isn't the
of not
beginning.
only the bass drum,
We need
the
to
snare drum,
start earlier than this.
cowbell, woodblock, small tom was at.
Yes, start.
The US beat is based on the swing pulse. The swing pulse developed out of the unique blend of African and European culture that occurred in the US through slavery. The African polyrhythmic concept of singing, dancing, and instrumental playing, when superimposed on the European concepts of time signatures and simple 2/4 rhythms, created a drum. Eventually became the rhythmic foundation of playing of the African American community from the South. The playing of African drums was outlawed in all of the American countries that had slavery, which included the US as well as the Caribbean islands and Brazil. But the no drumming laws were more strictly enforced in the US. As a result, the African hand drum tradition never developed in the US the way it did in many of the other countries that had slavery, such as Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Brazil. The US slaves used other percussion instruments to keep the African polyrhythmic concept alive, much of the time in secret. Some instruments were improvised, like the gumbo box, which was a sheepskin-covered frame drum, the jawbone, the washboard, clapping, beating on the floor with sticks, and stomping out rhythms with the feet, which by the 1900s developed into tap dancing. Another very interesting percussion style was called padding juba, which occurred in African American communities as well as some professional black minstrel shows. This seems to be the closest predecessor to drum set playing in the US. The padding, an ex-slave reported in 1853, performed by striking the hands on the knees, then striking the hands together, then striking the right shoulder with one hand, the left with the other, all the while keeping time with the feet and singing. Some percussion
Can we
instruments
put
the
this on
slaves
pause
used
now?
were European in origin, the triangle, the tambourine, and eventually.
Okay, so for me, this was, I understand this. I mean, in other words, I relate to it, but it just occurred to me this might be moving a little fast for you. Are there any questions about this before we continue? Is there anything in particular that you might have noticed that you might want to ask a question about?
I think it's absolutely fascinating. I was totally unaware that they were forbidden to play drums. It's a bit like Scotland, like play bagpipes. How interesting it is when someone's trying to stop a culture from continuing.
That's how the steel
You should
sounds got.
see it from my side.
And that was before Bush, too.
You know what I'm saying? In other words, one of the things about as I understand it, from people telling me, from my ancestry, that the two ways that you could instantly be legally killed is if you were caught in this country with a drum or a book.
A book.
Or a book.
What book was
They
it?
wanted to read it.
Yeah. Right.
You mean for blacks during the time of
Yeah,
slavery,
yeah,
they had a book
yeah.
they could.
Oh yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Couldn't learn to read.
They also used to communicate with like other plantations by singing and playing.
Well, that's obviously one of the reasons. Yeah, but I mean, so they didn't want you to be able to speak the language. You know, but you were only going to have to be able to respond like an animal. Like you know, like if you don't know the language, you know. So if somebody tells you to do something, and you don't understand what they're saying, so that you know, point and hit you with something until you understand that you do this by their command. So understand that out of this is what we're talking about, how the music that has now, there's not, you can watch CNN, any version of the news here, articulations of the so-called English that come directly from the Afro-American experience. There's nothing that I can see in contemporary America in terms of articulating the American experience that doesn't come from this. Whether it's Sex in the City, rolls, you know, whatever you call it. So anyway, without going any further, but I mean, that's what you just said. But does anybody else have anything that they saw and they didn't quite understand or?
Talked about padding.
Oh, right.
What was the second
When I grew up, when I came up, by the time I was in kindergarten, most of the kids could do that, except we called it doing the ham bone, right? Does that remind you?
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to be some kind of triplet. Yeah, but I mean, we had kids in that did that all the time, with spoons and
Oh, yeah.
yeah, something.
And he was relating that as the first, I mean, the beginning of the drum set.
Right, right.
You don't have drums, this is what you use your body.
Well, but I mean, that's that feeling, that's that beat, that's what you know, that we take for granted when we see Justin Timberlake or Bing Crosby or what's the jazz singer? Who's the? I mean, the movie called it Al Jolson.
But was there a drum set in Europe? Was there a drum, but there wasn't a set.
No, we're talking about before the drum set's invented right now. We're basically talking about the reason to invent a drum set.
When did they say, okay, now there's no more law against drumming, you won't be executed if you?
I don't know, maybe the Emancipation Proclamation, I don't know. Maybe.
After, yeah.
Yeah, after slavery is no
Well, yeah,
longer
of course, whites could
illegal.
play drums anyway,
Huh?
but it was just illegal for blacks to play drums.
Yeah, yeah.
It's very interesting.
Slaves.
So I mean, now, of course, we could go off on a whole tangent about slavery, but let's not do that. I just want to make sure everybody's pretty clear of what we've heard so far. Okay, should we move on?
Sure.
Okay.
They started playing the snare drum and bass drum. Some African Americans played drums in the military. Others played in brass bands, and others in the lesser-known fife and drum bands. When the drum set was invented in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the drummers from the African American community took a leading role in the development of drum set playing concepts by applying the swing pulse to drum set playing. In the late 1800s, the pulse of U.S. mainstream popular music was based largely on 2/4 feels and marching feels. That was about to change as the dancing styles and the swing beat that was emerging from the African American community in the early 1900s started to cross over and influence the pulse of all U.S. music.
Our first example in the history of the U.S. beat is ragtime. Ragtime was a style of music that was popular in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. It's primarily played on the piano, and it had its roots in European classical music, marching band form, and from the American community, bluesy melody and syncopation. Also at the end of the 1800s was the birth of the drum set. The bass drum pedal was invented in the late 1800s, but in 1909, when the Ludwig Drum Company invented a very practical and portable pedal, popularity of the drum set really took off. And back then the configuration was pretty simple, what you see here: bass drum, snare drum, maybe a few traps like this wood block. So we're going to play our example of ragtime.
Can we stop it again now? I hate to keep doing this.
Curtis stopped in 5 seconds.
You know, I guess he's, you know, with this, he's pretty concise. But we're now talking about the beginning of a multi-billion-dollar industry. We're talking about an industry that supports, a major supporter of this economy, of which is supposed to be, I guess, still the #1 economy on the planet. We still have another 30 years before China takes over, right? I mean, seriously, sincerely. So anyway, we're talking about this at the beginning. So for drum students, if you don't mind with this, the drum students right now, what we're looking at here is the drum respond to the bass clef of the ensemble. The bass clef, whether it be the trombone, the tuba, the bass violin, the electric bass, right? That the bass drum corresponds to that. So, or you can say that before you think about the acoustic bass or the bass of the piano, the drum did it first. So when you talk about drummers who understand or don't understand what they're doing or why they're doing it, it starts with that. The bass players play like the bass drum. The treble is the snare drum is the treble clef. The treble clef plays like the snare drum. It's not like the snare drum plays like the treble clef. So when we say treble clef, what are we talking about? We're talking about the guitar, the piano, the trumpet section in the big band. That's where all this comes from. If you have so-called jazz arrangements, you know, and so where do you want to go? I mean, you can go to Paul Whiteman. Let's see, how far back? We can talk about it. But anyway, that's what we're talking about now. I just want you to understand. He says ragtime. There's not even a bass there. So what's happening is a piano, I guess a modern version of the piano compared to what these guys were playing for silent films or dancing in these places where jazz was originally spelled J-A-S-S, which was to imply the bodies of women that were dancing in these places, jiving ass music. That's why you have people that like Duke Ellington and John Coltrane that didn't like the word jazz because it was, for them, was a derogatory term. But this was this African kind of dancing, because they could see how we're dancing today. I wonder what they, you know what I'm saying? But anyway, that the influence of that, of course, they were basically talking about Afro-American people that dance like that. So this negative connotation of this kind of dancing, which is not nearly of what's going on today. Anyway, it comes from this kind of drumming, and I guess we assume for you drummers that the Africans that did play these European instruments, in fact, were trying to bring back the science of maybe thousands and thousands and thousands of years of rhythm, the science of rhythm, to these American instruments. In the interim, in the meantime, while they're trying to do this, just because they are European instruments, they end up having to master the instrument the way the Europeans intended, thus coming up with something that neither the Europeans or the Africans had intended. This has become something entirely new at a time when anything that was new could be marketed during the, I wish I could speak better, between the difference between the industrial and technological revolution. This coincides, this new instrument coincides with the development of how you market a new capitalistic event. Was that said enough to be honest? All right, so now we can move on. stop it one more time. Now, I mean, that's one of the things about seeing that done like that is all of a sudden you're not looking at an old movie anymore. You're hearing actually the way that sounds. And for me, for the first time, I could really visualize why and how people would be dancing. You know, I mean, you can see it. I can feel it. It makes sense to me that people would want to dance to that, because I remember even when I was coming along in junior high school and high school, I heard the marching band in the parade field or in the football field. The tendency was to want to run to the window no matter what the lesson was and respond to that. It made you feel like something, you felt like whatever that sensation is that makes you feel like you're being entertained or something special is happening. Nobody just heard this marching stuff and said, well, look, would you close the window? I want to get back to mathematics. You know, they said, oh my God, oh, wow, oh. Yeah, I mean, the natural feeling to do that. And, yes?
Well, I just wonder, is anybody in particular that's associated with these, I mean, like creating music, or it just evolved without any drummer or?
Oh, well, I'm getting to that. And that would be the third perspective when we see traditional guys that did this. Okay. No, that's a good question. I mean, just to hear that feeling. I mean, and it's not much different than if you hear whatever we think rock and roll is today. I mean, it's still. It sounded like that there, but I mean, you can hear how it sounds here. I mean, all of a sudden I can understand. It made me feel like dancing, so all of a sudden it's not going to be corny like something I saw in what was the Three Stooges movie or something. Now I can really, I'm going to do that or feel that the next gig I play. You know, the next play, I'll understand it. I'll play with confidence, knowing that it feels good. It really feels that good to me, anyway. That piano player, after I saw Steve Smith in Japan, that piano player was on the kid, on the same gig I was on. Huh? Yeah. He's from the Bear? He's a great piano player. It was like before time on the gig I was on. after this, we'll stop it again. I'm waiting for him to talk about these different styles, but I will. Okay, I see what's happening. Stop. See, what we're missing is him making conversation between the different styles. I don't know why that's happening, but I'll do it instead now. So just stop. So actually, so what he's doing, he's talking about these different styles, and of course, where he doesn't mention is he's getting to the last time he talked, which I can't understand why that's not coming up, because he does talk about it on this. So maybe at another point we could start it all over and see if he does it again. But when he gets to this part, well, even before that, the guy that I consider the most famous exponent of that sort of ragtime feel or whatever was a guy named Warren Baby Dodds. Warren Baby Dodds. And that was, you know, right. And now at this point, at the next point, he's talking about which is an exponent, the most famous exponent of that style, as far as I'm concerned, is a guy named Jonathan Joe Jones, Papa Joe Jones. Now, the original foot symbol was a low symbol like this.
What year?
I don't know exactly. I would assume it would be in the early 30s. Anyway, I've got two other videos which will mention that. Anyway, but the guys like Baby Dodds and Zooty Singleton and Paul Barber and those guys, they didn't like that because they liked the flow, they liked the bass drum, they liked it's like the rock and roll guys today. I mean, if you hear rock and roll, if you take the bass drum away from that, then you see what's missing. So the bass drum is a very important part. I'm sorry?
I play a lot of rock.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but I just kind of like rock. So, and the most important thing to rock is fast foot.
So in other words, the bass drum and the foot are very important,
Yeah.
as it is in there, as it was for there. So when these guys had this low boy, they didn't like it. So it wasn't until it was in a higher version was invented, and they called it hi-hat. So then the guy that did the most with it, as far as I can understand at the moment, was a guy named Jonathan Joe Jones. But still was the bass drum. Now he moved to where this sound is moved to the what we refer to as the ride cymbal, exactly the same way. Reason for this, you know. And the guy that switches this for me is a guy named Kenny Clark. Right? Kenny Clark. Now, what we have is we no longer necessarily depend on this bass drum anymore. So we can also important were the actual harmonic forms for the musicians. For I mean, that's what I was just playing, or the bebop thing that he was showing was a song, a harmonic form of a song written by a piece, a work written by a genius, a master musician named Charlie Parker, and the tune was Confirmation. So I was basically playing that harmonic form. So it also implies that drummers can play these harmonic forms, feel and express these harmonic forms without having to play the actual notes on the piano. In other words, I felt that and heard that just as clearly as if I was hearing a saxophone or a trumpet player playing it, right? So that just shows that drummers hear the music like a conductor in a symphony orchestra hears the music, feels the music, as if he himself was playing the violin or the bass or the cellos or whatever. I mean, the drummer actually hears the music like that. So I'll do it again, like. It's called bebop. It's still related to one of the original rhythm or patterns that came along with ragtime and Dixieland, but comes basically from a funeral march, and we call it the second line. And that patterns, well, the second line, the first line was when you march to the funeral with the family or whatever. And the second line is when you're preparing for this repast after the funeral, where you in fact celebrate the person's life. So, or something like he's gone to a better place or something. Anyway, for some reason, after you come from the funeral, you're supposed to feel happy, I guess. And you're celebrating this person's life. And the rhythm goes like this. They didn't have drum sets, so you had a bass player playing and a cymbal player playing, and a snare drum playing. And somewhere around around this situation, the so-called multiple percussion trap drum set was invented. And so when you hear this rhythm, how Kenny Clark or Papa Joe Jones, we refer to Jonathan Joe Jones as Papa Joe, would develop it into something like this. That there, but it didn't come up.
He wanted you to do it.
Evidently. So at this point, I'm ready to leave this now, because now he's getting ready to go into rhythm and blues.
He's going through the history of jazz. I mean,
yes, he is. Well, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm basically, as I understand it. Yes, I'm sorry.
Each little song he's playing, the drum kit gets bigger.
Yes, it does. It shows the different design. So at this point, we can take this off.
I can't understand why I'm trying to figure out what in the world, why it would skip the certain parts.
There it is.
Well,
But see, yeah, that should have been happening earlier, that way he discusses it. But that's okay, I'm discussing it, and we can play it again tomorrow, because I still have at least 2 other viewpoints of this same concept that I want. And so
Remember the video on it?
I'm trying to think of how I want to do it at this point. Yeah, I guess we've got the other one.
Anybody need a break for
Yes.
anything?
incidentally, I didn't announce it, but there is a restroom there and there's one upstairs as well.
Records, tapes, radio, television. The drum set changes. And we have more of a reason. They'll say, when he did this thing, this Gene Krupa thing. It comes from basically, I think of it as the Benny Goodman story, because I was still watching it in movies myself then, where there was something about except that was supposed to be jungle playing or something. You know what I mean? You know, I don't want to go take it as far as minstrels painting their faces black, but you know, it was, you know, and that comes along. I mean, it was just a fad, not even 10 years ago, in England, where they were referring to a certain kind of pop music as jungle. You know, that goes, you know, it seems to, every now and then when we want to talk about the Afro-American experience or African experience, we'll say jungle, you know. Yes, sir.
Excuse me, did Fletcher Henderson write an arrangement for Sing Sing Sing? Didn't he write all those hits for Benny Goodman?
That's quite a possible. That's quite possibly. But it will be mentioned in this next thing. But anyway, that's, you know, and it started out, interestingly enough, as a vocal, as I found out. But people liked it so much, they took the vocal out. But still, just. And then, you know, for me, it didn't mean that much outside of the movie until I heard Elvin Jones had a version of it. Every now and then he would play, he would say. And so that's, if I would emulate it, I'd emulate it more from that concept. But I just know that I knew he loved Gene Krupa,
Yeah.
shoot, anyway, so maybe that's where he got it from.
Yeah, Marge said, well, that, on that Pepper Adams, Live the Fires, like with Pepper Adams, the album shows he plays that march kind of thing. Don't pay you, shut that, that.
Right.
Definitely.
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah.
And then you understand, for me, when looking at this and trying to do this out of this concept, it's really helped me identify more with why some of these things have been done or why they're being done, and you know how hip it is to do it. You know, yes, sir.
Talking about the drum rudiments, I mean, that thing's basically based on a parable. I mean, the things that we all learned, you know, that came from military bands, how they were adapted to jazz use.
Right.
I don't know, get real technical, I mean.
Well,
there are some
well,
drummers
there
that-
are 3-4 drummers here,
That's
right?
That's right.
Right. God, you know, I thought about this, how to talk about this. But when you talk about the so-called Afro-American after the Emancipation Proclamation, and there's different versions of how they got their hands on this European concept of drumming, right? Some people talk about how they could just go out in the fields with the dead bodies and just pick the drums out of the fields, because, you know, in those days, when the army, you know, if you're in the army band, you marched in front of the soldiers.
I could never understand.
That's a kind of interesting concept that we don't seem to do. So anyway, so I've heard that you know, there were certain people that just went in these fields and got the drums, and there evidently was some versions of what we look at as pawn shops today that you could also go and get these instruments really cheaply or something. So the point is that the drums were readily available if you wanted them. So now to play the instrument the way it was intended by the European concept, then there was a concept, a European concept that I guess we refer to now as rudimentary, or what is the word rudimentary, or rudiments. And as far as I can see, there's at least the English and French versions that seem to start with the Scottish pipe bands, right? The snare drum, Scottish pipe bands that's become, obviously that's already British, and the French seem to get it from that. And then there's also the baffled Swiss rudiments that now are popular among the really contemporary drummers of today. But that seems to be the foundation of the European rudiment concept that the Afro-American would have incorporated while trying to present his African roots with the instrument at the same time. So that's all I can say is that these guys got pretty good at combining both things, the European rudimentary concept with the African thing, which I like to say is probably, well, and actually I have a video that will talk about that. but it's how you add clave, what we call clave, to the European
Right.
rudimental concept that makes these rudiments that were basically done for marching and maybe for war, we takes it into a kind of fluctuating, what do you call it? When you fluctuate like that, undulation. Undulating, that we started naming swing or swinging or funky or something like that. It's by this thing that we call clave. That
Tell
we
them
heard it.
what the club is.
Ah,
Billy, it's
Before you, I didn't show the tape.
pro-Americans or whatever, you know, and they still call it clave.
Right.
Right,
The club.
yeah, right, so,
Wait,
but they also call it earl.
Right.
did you go to the bathroom?
Huh? Why, I mean, didn't anything else I say seem just as important as?
It kind of maybe a silly question, but you talk about